Hello and good morning. Is this close enough to the mic? All right, please, anyone, if you notice me drifting, I tend to talk actively. If you notice me drifting from the mic, please just, give me a little gesture, something like that. All right, I appreciate it. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good morning. I am thrilled to be here. Last time that I spoke to this congregation in fall, it was on Zoom, and it was lovely then. It was a wonderful response, but it is so much nicer to be here in person with at least some of you today and knowing that there's many more of you out there on the internet. But it really is so wonderful to be in community with you this morning. So to start us off, as we begin this conversation, I would like to ask you a hypothetical. So imagine that you have $2,000 that you would like, you're in the position to give it away. You would like to use it to feed the hungry, and your goal is to use it to get as much food to as many people as possible. You ask two different food banks what they would spend it on. Food Bank A says that they would spend it on food, pretty reasonable. Food Bank B says that they would spend it on an automatic window opening system for their warehouse. Just feeling out the room, who here would choose option A with the food? Hands? Yeah. Who here would choose option B, the windows? Okay, there's a few hands. Interesting. So before I blow your minds, I do want to introduce myself a little more. My name is Izzy Waxman. I'm the executive director of Mazon Canada, the Jewish response to hunger. Mazon is a grassroots community foundation that feeds people of all ages, ethnicities, faiths, and abilities all across Canada by supporting frontline food projects across the country. So we provide grants for food and equipment to food banks, like in this example, to school nutrition programs, to community gardens, to community kitchens, to hot meal programs at shelters. If it has to do with food, we're there. And in these last 2 pandemic years, we've provided over 600,000 meals to Canadians in need through our partners, which are over 200 programs all across Canada, spread over more than 100 Canadian towns and cities. So really from right downtown Toronto, familiar places, to the most rural, remote reaches, islands that are hanging off the coasts, really all over. And in my role as executive director of Mazon Canada, I will actually tell you that I would choose an option 3 between those two choices. I would choose to ask a question, and I will tell you what that question is in just a few moments, because to me the choice is not obvious, and I need some more clarity. But today, what I'd really like to talk to you about is what is so wrong with our charity system that by show of hands, nearly everyone in this room would have gotten the answer to that question wrong, would have made the wrong choice if what your goal is to get the most amount of food to the most amount of people. So to start us off, let's start with some plain talk about how the charity world operates. There are tens of thousands of registered charities in Canada. Their role is to support the common good, and they do it by investing any resources that they receive. They can, of course, issue tax receipts and collect donations, invest any resources they receive in their missions rather than in personal profits. And their missions vary. Some support poverty relief, the environment, civil rights. Others are hospitals or universities. But the idea is that they run their own programs directly. They provide services directly. We call these frontline agencies, legally, according to the CRA, charitable organizations. But there's another category of registered charities in Canada. And things get trickier when we talk about this other category of registered charities, which is foundations. Foundations can be private or public. Their role is not to do the frontline work. Their role is to fund these frontline organizations through grants. And I also want to mention some organizations that are technically charities do put foundation in their name. Just having foundation in your name doesn't mean you are a foundation. It's confusing. But let's talk about what a foundation is and how it works. So a public foundation might be an organization that raises funds to support a particular cause or area. For example, the Toronto Foundation, which supports programs that benefit the city of Toronto. Or even just one particular organization. For example, a foundation that funds a specific hospital. They make grants to support that cause, and they're legally restricted by their mission that they report to the CRA, and they have to do that work. A private foundation is funded and run by just one person or a family. And while they may declare a mission, like funding children's programs or environmental causes, they may not. There's no requirement that they stick to one issue or area. For the most part, their funding is decided by that person or family's interests, and they can change year to year, month to month. A private family foundation is run like a one-way bank account that's reserved for charity. Once you put money in, you can't take it out again. It's not yours. Legally, you've given it to another legal entity, even if it's one that you are in decision-making control of. You can't take it back. And that money now belongs to the foundation. So following the law, it can only go to other registered charities. That's how the law works. But there's a few problems with this system. And I want to emphasize here that if you're making gifts under $1,000, or even if you're making bigger gifts, but they're going to frontline charities, you don't need to worry about how your gifts are spent. Don't worry. The only people who might be concerned by what I have to say is people who are making very large gifts, or people who are giving to foundations or donor-advised funds. We can talk about that. And for those people, if you're one of those people who's making very large gifts and you're concerned, then come see me after the service. I might want to give you a pamphlet. I'm kidding. That's a joke. Okay, but for real, I'll talk about what those people should do soon. Am I good? Mic-wise? Okay, great. But first, let's talk about problems with this system. So one problem is this. You get a tax receipt for putting money into a foundation, and once you've done that, you can wait pretty much as long as you want before you actually move that money to a frontline charity. Many family foundations do incredible work funding critical organizations all across Canada, and Mazon is privileged to work with some really, really visionary families, really, really wonderful people. But many other family foundations collect their tax receipt when they put their money into their foundation, and then forget about the part where they move it to actually helping people. But if they're collecting tax receipts for making donations, shouldn't there be some legal requirement that they actually do the helping people part? And of course, there's a legal requirement. Foundations in Canada are required to move 3.5% of their holdings every year. So $1 million foundation has to spend $35,000 on actually helping people, while keeping $965,000 in the bank, and they can just go ahead and add another $1 million next year with the exact same payouts. About 12% of registered charities in Canada are foundations. And the most recent data that I can get shows that together they control, I'd actually like to hear guesses from anyone who's here in person. How much money would you guess is currently under the control of Canadian foundations? What sounds like a big number? 50 billion? Couple of hundred billion. Okay, whoa, big gap. It's actually 90 billion. You're real pessimistic, I guess. Or optimistic, I'm not sure your framework. And you were pretty close. It's $90 billion. Right, okay, so, and that number is shocking not only for its size, although not as shocking as it is to, could be more shocking, I guess. But it's not only shocking for its size, but it's shocking for its rate of growth. Because the same study that came up with this $90 billion also tracked those things over a decade. And just 10 years before that $90 billion, it was $30 billion. It tripled in a 10-year period. When you'd imagine it should be shrinking, it should be given away. And in that same year that $90 billion was calculated, foundations granted just 7% of their holdings, while 93% stayed in the bank. More than half that money is in private family foundations, which grew from holding $4 billion in 2006 to over $44 billion in 2019. And in the same time period, where they increased by $40 billion, their giving increased by only $700 million. Just a tiny fraction. And, okay, if we really want to get pessimistic, who wants to take a crack at what that number looks like in the US? How much money would you think American foundations are currently holding? Money that was donated, receipted, hypothetically for the common good. A trillion? It's $1.7 trillion. In billions, let me do that math for you, that's 1,700 billion dollars theoretically donated for the public good, receipted by the taxpayer. And when we say, by the way, that it's just sitting in the bank, let's talk about what sitting in the bank means, because it doesn't just sit there. The bank is investing it. The bank is using it to generate profits for itself. And we'd love to imagine the bank is investing it in small business loans to mom and pop hopefuls. Wouldn't that be adorable? But no, a lot of the times these banks are investing it in natural resource extraction, including fossil fuels. They're investing it in warmongering arms dealers. They're investing it in the companies that promise the most profits by paying the lowest wages to impoverished overseas workers. And so all of this money that was theoretically supposed to be spent on the common good, money that has already been receipted at the taxpayer's expense. And so, yeah, remember that while tax credits for donations are a great incentive to give for you and I, they operate differently on the scale of the mega, mega, mega wealthy. And knowing that those people already have more than they need, they can dodge a significant portion of income tax by donating these huge sums of money. A system that legalizes, or rather incentivizes, tax dodging through charitable giving, even for the mega wealthy, implies that these individuals have the right to make decisions about how that money should be spent towards the common good instead of voters, with no accountability at all. So now that I've said a number of strongly worded things about the charitable sector, I want to emphasize again, this is not a reason to be skeptical of frontline charities, no matter their size, most of whom have small reserves, if any. And just like in personal finances or business, having a rainy day fund is a responsible choice that charities should not be penalized for. So please don't go mistrusting a charity based on the number of digits in their bottom line. The real problem is the structure of private philanthropy that allows for very wealthy people to get tax receipts for money that isn't helping anyone. So if you're making gifts under $1,000, again, you do not have to be worried about how your gifts are spent. Or, and even if you're making larger gifts, but they're going directly to frontline charities, not to foundations or donor-advised funds, you don't need to be worried either. We're good. The only people who should maybe be worried are, again, people making larger gifts to foundations rather than to frontline charities. And I'll talk more about what those people should be doing later. But first, here's another big problem that affects how all of our donations are used, large or small, which will bring us back to our food versus windows question. I want to talk about the myth of overhead. Because these huge foundations control so much money, they set the industry standards. The frontline charities have to respond to their interests and impress them in order to get funding. So one huge problem in the charitable sector is a myth that our culture holds about money, that anyone with more money must be smarter and anyone with less must make worse choices. It can look like saying on a personal scale, oh, don't give money to that homeless person, she might spend it on drugs. Or it might be venerating the self-made billionaire who actually started with a giant inheritance from his parents. So this mentality that the haves know and the have-nots know not can show up in charities as well. And in the charity world, it looks like mistrust between funders and charities. Concerns about overhead, about performance metrics, about efficiency. And this mistrust has the most power when it comes from big money foundations. But the rest of us have all been trained as well to view things from their powerful perspective and look at charities this way. So how does that treatment affect charities? Let's talk about what that mistrust does on the ground. How it affects the causes and charities that you support, even if you're not one of these 20 wealthiest foundations in Canada. So foundations often require charities to fill out long applications for even small grants. They expect them to track performance metrics that make sense to the funders, but not to the people on the ground, which fills their days with busy work. The work that we need to do to address issues like poverty and the environment is messy, and it's slow. You can count the meals that you provide easily, but it's harder to count the breakthrough moments of self-esteem. It's harder to count the days that go by without significant symptoms of mental illness. It's harder to count how many heart attacks won't happen 50 years from now because children today are being fed adequate diets in their most critical years. Changing lives doesn't fit neatly into performance metrics. When charities are pressured to do work that looks good on paper to people who have never done that work, they're often pulled away from the work that would make the biggest change. And they have to do additional work to track those ineffective metrics and report it in very specific ways to those foundations. If you're worried about charities working inefficiently or wasting time or money, it's not the frontline charities that you should be critical of. It's the foundations that make them jump through hoops. So let's talk about that hypothetical gift again. You've got $2,000 and you want to use it to feed the most amount of food to the most amount of people. Food Bank A says that they would spend it on food, and Food Bank B says that they would spend it on an automatic window opening system. And I told you before that I would ask a question before I made a decision. And I'll tell you now that this window example is not hypothetical. It's a real request that Mazon Canada got for funding about a year ago. And I'll tell you what happened. The question that I would ask is this: how would it help? What would it do for your community? What would it do for your food programs and to move you towards your mission? Food Bank A says that the way it would help is that if they got $2,000, they could buy about 600 meals worth of groceries. Fantastic. Definitely in line with our priorities and theirs. Clear use. Fantastic. Food Bank B says that their windows in their warehouse space, their donated warehouse space, are 1 story up, and they're meant to be opened with an automatic system at the push of a button, so no one has to climb up there, a system which broke down many years ago. And because their windows are broken, this warehouse space is an absolute hot box in summer. They lose a lot of volunteers over summer, and they have a hard time recruiting new ones. People come once, have a terrible time, sweating all day, and they never come back. Plus, volunteers who do stick around can't help but work more slowly in the summer, so they lose productivity. Retirees have the most daytime availability to volunteer, but it's actually dangerous for many of them to be working in those conditions, and keeping everyone hydrated is a problem. Plus, with mandates lifted, ventilation is of a higher priority than ever, and many potential volunteers don't feel safe working in an unventilated space. If they could only open the windows, they could bring in dozens more volunteers, they could move more food. And the food that they move, the more food that they move, the more available rescued food they could receive. So suddenly that 1,000 pounds of food that they can suddenly move, so spending $2,000 on this one-time fix would sustainably increase their ability to serve food, potentially by an extra 1,000 pounds a week ongoingly for many, many years. So I'll ask you again, if with that in mind, if your goal is to get as much food to as many people as possible, who would still choose Food Bank A? Who would spend it on their 600 meals? It's different. You would? All right. All right. let's have I'm curious about those reasons. Let's have a conversation about it after. But I do want to make it clear that the programs that maybe look good to people who have never done this work are not necessarily the best, most efficient way to address the problem. Sometimes the best way to get people out of poverty is not to give them a food hamper, but to get them access to a social worker who can help them with paperwork and mental health supports. A social worker whose pay might look like overhead on a financial statement. These problems are complex because people are complex and systems are complex. And let me tell you something else. Food Bank B, who said that they needed food, they might have been lying to you. What they might actually need, not that they don't need it, but that they have other things that they need more. They might actually need to give their fundraiser a raise so she doesn't take a job at another organization because they don't know what they would do without her. They might need to upgrade their database software because it was built to track how many people come in for visits, but not what they talk about at those visits, which is really important information for them to be able to serve these people. They might lose hundreds of hours trying to figure out workarounds around this system every year. And they might need to hire a marketing consultant because, quite frankly, they don't understand social media and they know that they need to. So why would they save food if they have all these other needs that would actually help them so much more than a one-time purchase of 600 meals? Because they have learned from years of experience that if they don't save food, you probably won't pick them. And worse than this, charities are not the ones most affected. The clients are. The people who access these services are the true experts on their own needs and the truly vulnerable here. On this level, we also see that rich people must be smarter and better mentality playing out once again. And just like with many foundations, everyone involved has the very best intentions. In the worst case scenarios, well-intentioned people start charities that end up duplicating work that's already been done, competing for resources with existing projects. Good could be better. And even in really good situations, in better case scenarios, charity leaders are just doing their best balancing between people who are suffering and begging for a service and people who will only donate if that money goes to something else. Charities need financial stability. They need to be able to hold a modest reserve for a rainy day or take time to think strategically when they receive a major gift without being punished for already having money in the bank. We expect charities to constantly balance on a knife's edge, proving their desperation. They can't do the long, deep, messy work when they're under constant scrutiny. So there's two core problems here. The first is this: we built the system upside down. We're letting the people who know the least about poverty make the decisions about how to address poverty. Imagine how things would change if we all listened to the people with the least voice in decision-making, who are the people with the most expertise about the problems faced by poor people. Imagine if we build our poverty response around their needs instead of what we think their needs should be. Imagine if we trusted our community leaders and supported their work instead of scrutinizing them from a place of ignorance. And imagine how things would change if that $90 billion currently being held by Canadian foundations was immediately moved into low-income communities with input and direction from the people most affected. We could fix boil water advisories in Indigenous communities. We could train people to maintain those systems long-term. We could build affordable housing with bylaws that keep their rent below market rate. We could put kids from poor families through college. Just imagine it. We could build lasting infrastructure and break cycles of poverty sustainably for families and communities across Canada. And the solution to this core problem of our upside-down system? Listening. We have to listen to the people most affected by the problems that we're trying to solve. And then, we need to not just move money, but decision-making power into the hands of the powerless, because they're the ones who know best what they need. We need to stop believing that wealthy people know the most, and remember that while they may be brilliant at business or public speaking or experts in their fields, they may also be, and I will say this, an absolute ignoramus at one specific thing, which is the lived experience of being poor today in 2022. And the other problem? The other core problem. Let me tell you a story first. In 1986, when Mazon was founded, Reagan and Thatcher had just rolled back the social safety net, and the Western world followed. In the wake of a society that had until then, for a time, ensured that wages were more or less fair compared to the cost of living, and supports were available for those who could not work, the patchwork of charities exploded. As the state failed to provide, nonprofits collaborated to build bridges between them, built out of popsicle sticks and duct tape and hopes and dreams, and just trying to fill the gaps. Burned out volunteers who couldn't stand to see suffering found ways on shoestring budgets to grow their organizations. And food pantries began to pool resources to create a new collective thing that they called a food bank, one centralized institution that could collect food for a whole municipality or county. And and that was just one cause. Poverty is a disease with many symptoms. Violence, hunger, homelessness, mental health, physical health. And while these heroes strained under the weight of supporting those that the state had abandoned, they soothed themselves by saying, this is only temporary. This is only temporary. We're going to fight for policy change. We're going to make things right again. We're going to put things back how they should be. And I'll tell you, when Food Banks Canada was founded in 1988, they had a sunset clause in their original mission to be out of business by 1991 because they believed that the social safety net would be robustly back. Under pressure and underfunded, charities struggle to keep up with the day-to-day demands, and most small charities rarely have time to meaningfully collaborate, to talk to each other, to find gaps in their network of programs, and to pool resources to fill them. They know their clients have bigger problems than their services can fix, a lack of affordable childcare or housing, but these are issues that can only be addressed on a societal level. It should never have been their problem. So here's our second problem. As a society, we have absolved ourselves of the public responsibility to care for our most vulnerable people. We have passed it off onto a disconnected patchwork of privatized institutions, charities that, because of this funding model, are beholden to the whims of those who know the least about their work and which are constantly under-resourced. And when the best of them do take the time to, and money and energy to collaborate and advocate towards problems that might take years or decades to fix, well, where's the performance metrics on that? How can you prove that you'll use this money efficiently? It looks like there's an awful lot of overhead on this financial statement. You feel me? But I also want to remind you of something. At the very beginning of this, didn't I say that Mazon was a community foundation? If foundations are so evil, then what am I doing running one? And of course the answer is that foundations aren't evil, and neither are the people who give to them. Everyone at every level here really does have the best intentions. But across society, we've been trained to think about this work upside down. So a lot of that good intention gets lost. But what is Mazon doing differently? How are we putting things right side up? What does a healthier, more just philanthropy look like right here in the Jewish community? Firstly, we're listening. We're asking for feedback from our grantees, and we're doing the work to build trust so we get honest answers. We tell our partners there's no need to impress us by sounding good on paper. Please give us the truth so we can help you with that real, deep, messy work. And when we get feedback, we act on it. This has changed our grant making in a couple ways. There's some very simple ways to start. We shortened our application process so that they can focus less on impressing us and spend more time actually helping people. We're even running a pilot right now of multi-year grant commitments to a small cohort of organizations that we've worked with for many years. So they don't need to spend time and energy telling us the same things about themselves every year. We know them, we trust them. An updated financial statement and a few phone calls a year we're between two people who actually know each other, who can have a frank conversation about how the program is going. That's enough when you have a proven track record of many years of trusting communication and excellent programming. But a bigger way that this has changed our grant making is that it's changed what we fund. We used to have a restriction to only fund food. Our mission is, and will always remain, hunger. But even keeping the focus on food, when we started asking, what would help your food programs the most? The answer was not always groceries. So we started looking for patterns between requests, and we started experimenting with small pilots and figuring out how we could not just fund this work, but also explain the impact of this work, the deeper, messier work, to our community, to the Jewish community. So here's a few examples. In 2019, we started funding community gardens and infrastructure. We now have 3 main granting streams: groceries, gardens, and gear. Our grocery grants are the biggest part of our work and still fund the direct purchase of food. It turns out when you ask food programs what they need the most, plenty of them do still say food. Our garden grants fund community gardens across the country. And with upfront costs like fencing and fertilizer and shovels and irrigation taken care of, they can spend just pennies a year on seeds and be able to feed their communities, grow their own fresh, free food ongoingly for many years to come. Plus, they can teach people how to grow their own food at home. Our gear grants are even better. Many organizations requested support for infrastructure, mostly fridges, freezers, and vehicles for food delivery. And I have to say, fridges and freezers are my favorite. In areas where it's possible to rescue food that would otherwise head to landfills, either through partnerships with farmers or grocery stores or with a food rescue organization like Second Harvest, they're actually a fantastic investment. For the same $10,000 that you might spend on maybe 3,000 meals at a grocery store, you can get instead 2 industrial fridges that help them receive 1,000 pounds of healthy, perishable food rescued a week, easily for 10 or 15 years, as long as those fridges will last. And they have upstream benefits. Being able to keep food longer means more flexibility around volunteer schedules, which brings in more volunteers, which moves that 1,000 pounds to 1,500. We also experiment with out-of-the-box ideas that we call our innovative grants. One of the most exciting to me was a early pilot that we ran last summer. We know that many of our grantees say that their funding priority is staffing, another thing that looks like overhead on paper. Last summer, we gave $10,000 to a food bank in Mississauga to extend their volunteer coordinators' hours. Before the grant, they were moving 45,000 pounds of food a week, which was stretched to their limit. Without a volunteer coordinator, their other staff were pulled away from their desks to cover volunteer shifts. That meant hours and hours of lost work for their fundraiser, for their community partnerships coordinator, for whoever happened to be around. And without a reliable coordination schedule, volunteers were not effectively onboarded, which meant not only lost efficiency, but a disinterest in returning. With this $10,000 grant, they were able to move an extra 30,000 pounds of food over 10 weeks. Spent on food at even our most efficient partners, that $10,000 would have provided at most 10,000 meals. So if there had been only one effect of this grant, and it would have been to triple the amount of food they move, Dayenu, it would have been enough. Triple the impact. But there was so much more. They also improved the quality control of the other 450,000 pounds of food that was moved during that period. And fresher food arriving to clients meant that it lasted a few more days in the fridge. It meant that there was a better chance of it getting eaten before it molded by morning. They solved their volunteer retention issue when their coordinator had time to make onboarding videos so people could work effectively and feel like they're making a difference, inspiring them to come back. And lastly, having their staff back at their desks meant that they could work on other projects, like partnering with a local composting facility to buy the food that doesn't pass quality control, minimizing food waste emissions, and creating an ongoing source of revenue for the food bank. And there were even more effects. I could go on. All of this amazing work from staffing costs, something that another funder might have dismissed as overhead. And by the way, I'll mention this now, if you have an interest in joining our allocations committee and helping us sort through all these fascinating requests and making efficient decisions, get my email from the Social Action Committee, please. But the learning process that we've been through as a staff and board has also changed our vision of who we need to prioritize in funding. We know now that the people who are closest to the issues are the people with the sharpest vision for what needs to change. And that's why this year with our innovative grants, we started with a focus on organizations led by immigrants, specifically by women of color. One went to an organization called Nutrition Blocks in Ottawa, an organization that builds connections, that does that deep, confusing, critical work of building connections between existing food programs, seeking to find the gaps between them and fill them with collaboration, making the whole food sector in the city more efficient. Last year, their research showed them that there were two populations falling through the cracks between in their audit of all the food programs in the area. And that was seniors and ethnocultural minorities. So they launched programs to serve those communities. They pulled rescued food staples from one program and delivery volunteers from another and put them together to launch a pilot program delivering culturally specific food hampers to 3 priority ethnic groups: Haitian, West African, and Latino seniors. They were testing to see if they could source specialized ingredients, combine them with rescued food, and offer this service at cost, which would be significantly below the retail prices that those fixed income seniors would be paying at stores. Through Mazon's support, they were able to expand the program to 2 more ethnocultural groups, both of whom require specialized proteins: Arab Muslims who require halal food, and indigenous people who require local meat sources like deer, moose, or salmon. And if the pilot is successful, which the previous pilots strongly imply that it will be, this will be a financially self-sustaining program from the end of the pilot on that lasts. So this kind of innovative program, pulling together resources from across the sector to meet specialized needs, is most possible if 2 factors are present. 1, leadership that really understands the needs of their clients, because they're the same needs shared by that leader and their community. Similar challenges. And 2, the deep work of planning, meaning, and collaborating that's too often written off as overhead. So also as a side note, why Mazon? Wouldn't it be best then to give directly as possible to all these small food programs across the country? And maybe I'll say something crazy here, but yeah, sure, go ahead. I don't want to be competing with them for resources. They're really great programs. But also, if you would like to do the research that we've done on hundreds of small food agencies across the country and pick between them yourself, please go ahead. And if you would like some support in doing that, or to make a single gift that can benefit programs near and far, programs doing long, deep work and short-term immediate work, Mazon's got you. Mazon is a great option. And Where was I? Oh, right. And through Mazon, your gifts can be pooled with others to have bigger impacts than they would on their own. Although, again, if you are in a position to just spend $10,000 to buy a single fridge unit for an organization, please come talk to me, because I know a guy who needs one very badly. So please come. And best of all, through Mazon, these gifts are made not just by you or me, but by the Jewish community of Canada. It's a way to bring Jewish chesed to even the most remote regions of our country and work against the anti-Semitic beliefs of Jewish selfishness and greed. So what should we do about this mess that we're in? $90 billion locked away, a charity industry full of amazing people beholden to the expectations of the people least well-equipped to lead them, a system that makes it taboo to question any of this, lest you be branded uncompliant or earn suspicion that you're hiding something. First of all, I said I'd mentioned this before, if you are a person making gifts through a private foundation, please move that money as fast as you can. There are people who need it so badly, so much worse than the bank. And if you give through a donor-advised fund, please, again, advise them. Move the money as fast as you can. People need it. And for all of us givers, for gifts of any size, worry less how an organization reports its paperwork and worry more about building relationships. Maimonides himself wrote that donors should not concern ourselves with nitpicking at who is more or less deserving. We should give with trust and goodwill, not knowing exactly who will receive. Seek to understand the sources of these problems and how the charities you love are working to address them. Volunteer with humility, seeking to offer what's needed, not what you think charities should prioritize. And outside of our giving, listen, learn. Turn your attention to the people who are too often shut out of boardrooms and executive suites. Women, people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities. Listen to how they talk about their problems when they're talking to each other. Sign up for newsletters and news sources and social media channels that discuss their most pressing issues. And trust that even if what you hear sounds shocking to you, they are the experts on their own lives. Know that even within the Jewish community, there are people seeking to do this listening and learning. But above all, I invite you this Shabbat to stand with me and to stand with Mazon as we turn our minds towards advocacy. I'd like to tell you one last thing about how the listening has changed Mazon. We're returning to our roots in fighting for policy change. Let's roll back to 1986 again, in the wake of clawbacks of the social safety net, as nonprofits exploded in a desperate effort to feed and clothe and house all of those who were suddenly abandoned, the year of Mazon's birth. Our mandate was never just to feed the hungry, but to do it while educating the Jewish community about the realities of hunger and about what they personally could do about it, while mobilizing all of those people towards advocacy. And 36 years since then, we have not yet succeeded in making things right again. Those policies have not changed, and instead the patchwork quilt of nonprofits has grown bigger and bigger, and many of us have forgotten that things used to be any different, or that any part of this could be any different. Our welfare system is threadbare, and our charity system is upside down. Mazon's goal is not to prop up this well-intentioned but hopelessly inefficient system of tens of thousands of disconnected charities. It's a hunger-free Canada. Granting to feed the hungry is what we have to do in the meantime, as we continue the long, deep, messy work to turn the system back right side up. For too long, our leaders have prioritized the needs of wealthy people, while Canada's most vulnerable suffer. And our leadership, too, is upside down. When you vote, look for policy change on rental housing, on affordable childcare, disability supports, issues of concern to people who are living on the knife's edge, living paycheck to paycheck. Fight to change the things that would make charity unnecessary. Fair labor conditions and wages, affordable costs for housing, healthcare, childcare, and education, and for a universal basic income that ensures that no person should suffer the indignities of homelessness or hunger, regardless of their ability to work. I've invited you to imagine many things with me this morning. Hopeful things, idealistic things. We need creative imagination to think our way out of a mess this big and this complex and this long-standing. But I'll ask you to imagine one more thing with me. Maimonides once wrote that the highest level of charity is one that breaks the cycle of poverty overall, forever. Imagine a world where our governments, our institutions, and our personal giving followed the sage advice of the Rambam. Put the money where it's needed. Remove the scarcity mindset. Build the infrastructure, teach the skills, give the opportunities, remove the barriers, break the cycle. At Mazon, we don't dream of providing more meals next year than the year before. We dream of a Canada without poverty, a Canada without hunger, and a Canada without charity at all. Thank you very, very much to the Social Action Committee for inviting me this Shabbat morning. Oh, I don't know how we do clapping in Shul. And thank you very much for attending both online and in person. Shabbat Shalom.